The trauma bay doors hit the wall so hard a ceiling tile rattled loose and nobody looked up. 3 paramedics were already calling out numbers. Blood pressure tanking, pulse thready, exit wound the size of a closed fist punched through the left side of his back. The man on the gurney was the color of wet concrete, eyes half open, lips moving without making any sound that the room could catch. Dr. Marcus Holt was already gloved, already in position, best trauma surgeon at Hargrove General in the city of Crestfield. That was what the lobby plaque said, and in 12 years, nobody had seriously challenged it. He didn't lose patience in the first 60 seconds. That was not something he did. He had no intention of starting tonight. But then the dying man's hand shot out and clamped around his wrist, and the grip had no business being that strong in a body losing blood that fast. The whole room stuttered. Holt looked down at the hand, looked up at the face. The man's cracked lips moved. Everyone in the bay leaned forward without meaning to. 2 words came out. "Get Simone." Holt straightened slowly. He looked around the trauma bay. His eyes landed on a nurse standing near the supply cart at the far wall. Medium height, dark-skinned, braided hair tucked under a scrub cap, hands already loose and still at her sides like she had been waiting for something and had gotten very good at not showing it. "Her?" Holt said. "She's a floor nurse. Move her back." The man on the gurney didn't look at Holt. His eyes didn't move from her face, and Simone Voss didn't move. If this story already has its hooks in you, follow me right now, stay until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night had started the way every Thursday started. Simone Voss pulled into the Hargrove General parking structure at 6:44, 13 minutes before her shift began, because she was always early and no one had ever once commented on it. She changed in the locker room in the usual quiet, nodded to Della, washing her hands at the corner sink, caught 2 sentences of Priya complaining about the vending machine eating her dollar again. And then she walked out to the ER nursing station and picked up whatever chart was sitting on top of the stack. That was the job. Pull the next chart, work the next patient, document it, go home. She had done that at Hargrove for 4 years. Before that, 2 years at a county trauma center downstate. Before that was a different kind of life entirely, and she did not discuss it. Hargrove General was a level 1 trauma center, which meant Crestfield scented everything. Gunshots, MVAs, industrial accidents, strokes, the slow internal disasters that people carried around for decades before something finally gave way. It was a good hospital, the way a sharp knife is a good knife. Efficient, precise, completely indifferent to whoever happened to be holding it on any given night. Simone fit there without friction. She was good at her work in a way that didn't draw attention, which was the way she preferred. She caught things other people missed. She remembered dosages without double-checking. She could get a line in a blown-out vein in under 40 seconds, and she never made a point of mentioning that to anyone. She just did it and moved to the next task. What 4 years had taught her was that Hargrove ran on a hierarchy as fixed as any she had encountered, and she had encountered a few. At the top was Dr. Marcus Holt. His name on the plaques, his photo in last spring's Crestfield magazine spread on medical excellence, his voice the loudest and most certain in any room he entered. He was genuinely skilled. That was real. But the skill had folded into the identity so completely that he could no longer separate confidence from correctness, and nobody around him was positioned to point that out. Below Holt were the attending physicians. Below them, the residents. Below them, the senior nurses, then the junior nurses, then the aides and techs. Somewhere in that lower tier was Simone, a nurse who kept her observations to herself, who let residents talk over her without turning it into a confrontation, who had learned over a long time and in contexts far more extreme than this, that being underestimated had its uses. She called it absorbing. That was the private word for it. Absorb and move on. She was charting at the station around 9 when the radio broke through the floor noise. Paramedic unit inbound. Male, mid-40s. GSW to the back. Suspected internal hemorrhage. Pressure dropping. ETA 4 minutes. Simone stood up before the charge nurse finished processing the call. She moved a trauma cart to Bay 1, ran through the airway tray, confirmed suction, had an IV kit open, and positioned by the time the bay doors swung wide. Standard prep. She had done it hundreds of times. Her hands worked from memory and left her mind free to think about other things. What she was not ready for was the face on the gurney. She caught it in the first half-second, a glimpse across the bay before the paramedics shifted and blocked her view, the set of the jaw even through the pain. A scar along the left temple, pale and slightly raised, the kind that doesn't come from anything ordinary. She knew that scar, not from this hospital or any hospital. Her hands kept moving. The IV kit was open, the tourniquet was ready, her fingers were doing what they always did. But something behind her sternum went very quiet. Holt was already running the room, gloved, positioned, voice steady and authoritative, as he pulled vitals from the paramedics and began building his plan in real time. He was good at this part. The controlled chaos was where he was best, and he knew it, and everyone in the room knew he knew it, and that dynamic worked until it didn't. He called for vitals. Got them, ran the numbers fast and started calling orders. Then the man's hand came up and locked around his wrist. The room didn't go silent. Monitors kept running. Someone's shoe caught the floor wrong. But the human noise dropped away. Everyone in the bay looked at the patient. Then they looked at Holt. Then they followed the dying man's eyes across the room. To Simone. Get Simone. She felt it, the weight of the whole room shifting to look at her. The charge nurse near the door, 2 residents, the paramedics who hadn't left yet, all of them taking in the same image. Scrub cap, sensible shoes, an IV kit in her hands, nobody's idea of whoever this man thought she was. Holt turned around slowly. He looked at her the way you look at something that has appeared in the wrong place. She's a floor nurse, he said. Move her back. He asked for me by name, Simone said. Her voice came out flat and even. She was mildly surprised by that. He's losing blood, and he's half delirious. Holt had already turned back to the patient. You're not cleared for this bay on a trauma call. Step out. She could have pushed. She had ground to push on. She could see from where she was standing that the exit wound pattern was wrong for where Holt was about to focus. The man's abdomen was guarding. His breathing had an asymmetry on the left side that wasn't showing up in anything the monitors were tracking. She had clocked it in the first 15 seconds without meaning to. She said nothing. She stepped back to the edge of the bay. This was the part she was practiced at. The next several minutes were everything Holt was trained to do. He moved with efficiency and authority, calling for a central line, pushing fluids, ordering a fast exam to check for internal bleeding. The ultrasound wand swept across the patient's abdomen in the 4 standard positions. The resident reading the screen said everything looked clear. Simone stood at the bay's edge and kept her mouth shut, but she was watching the monitor and watching the patient's face and counting the seconds between his breaths, and she understood what she was looking at, even if no one in the room was looking at the same thing. The fast had missed it. Free fluid didn't always collect where the imaging protocols expected. If the diaphragm was involved, and based on the trajectory she had mapped in her head the moment the gurney came through the door, it was the blood could be tracking high and posterior, sitting outside the standard acoustic windows. The scan had covered the right positions. It had just covered the wrong anatomy. She didn't say it. She stood at the edge of the bay and absorbed it. Then the blood pressure dropped 12 points in under a minute. BP crashing, someone called from behind the monitor. 80 over 50, 76. Holt pivoted immediately, calling for O negative, calling for surgical backup, calling for, it's posterior. She said it before she made a decision to say it. It came out the same way it always had, not loud, not aggressive, just certain. The room stopped. Holt turned around, and the expression on his face was a very specific temperature of cold. Not hot anger, but something measured and controlled and far more deliberate. The look of a man who had built his entire professional identity on being the most competent person in any room he walked into, and who had just been interrupted by someone who was not supposed to have an opinion. Excuse me, the bleed, it's posterior and superior, left hemodiaphragm involvement. The fast missed it because the blood is tracking up and back. You need an extended view, high intercostal, left lateral decubitus position. She kept her voice even. If you keep pushing fluids into the wrong compartment, he codes in the next 4 minutes. No one in the bay moved. Holt's jaw was set. Dr. Pierce. He looked at the resident nearest the door. Please escort Nurse Voss. Nurse Voss to the waiting area. If you move me out and I'm right, she said, same tone, no escalation, you'll have 4 minutes to figure that out. And then you won't have any more minutes. The monitor alarmed. 61 over 42. The resident holding the ultrasound wand looked at Holt. Holt looked at the monitor. Then he looked at Simone. And something happened in the half second after that. Not agreement, she would never have called it agreement, but a fracture, a crack in the certainty, small enough that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it. "Show me," he said, like the two words cost him. She crossed the bay, took the wand, repositioned it, high, intercostal, patient rolled slightly left, and tilted the angle back and upward. The screen shifted. Dark shadow bloomed in the image, a significant pocket of free fluid sitting exactly where she had said it was. Nobody spoke. "There's your bleed," she said, and handed the wand back. Holt didn't respond to her directly. He moved, fast and decisive, calling the corrected orders without hesitation, pivoting the entire approach with the fluency of someone who knew how to recover even when recovery required that he not acknowledge what he was recovering from. He didn't say she was right. He didn't look at her again. He just worked, and he worked well, and the patient's pressure began to climb. Simone stepped back to the edge of the bay and picked up the IV kit she had set down. Across the room, the man on the gurney was watching her. Still was, through all of it. His eyes were clearer now that the crisis had a direction. Still wrecked with pain, still carrying something that wasn't just physical, but present, aware. The room was loud with pre-op prep when he turned his head toward her and said something barely above a breath. She almost missed it under the noise. She didn't miss it. He said her call sign. 6 years. 6 years since she had heard that word spoken out loud by any human being. It was not on her nursing license, not on any record in this hospital's system, not on her resume or her tax forms or her lease or anything else she had built over the last 6 years. To be a person who worked nights in an emergency room and went home to a one-bedroom apartment and had a life that fit inside the lines. It was a name from a chapter that didn't have a chapter heading, from work that had no job title, from a version of herself she had put away so completely and so carefully that she occasionally went entire weeks without remembering it had been real. Her hands went still. She looked at him. He was looking back at her. Not at the nurse, not at the woman in the scrub cap, at something behind that. At something she had spent 6 years making sure no one in this city could see. "You need to rest," she said. Quiet, steady. "Surgery in a few minutes." Simone. His voice was threadbare but deliberate. Every word cost him something he wasn't sure he had left. "It wasn't random. Me ending up here tonight." He stopped for a breath. "Let it pass. Took me 3 months to find you. 3 months." Another stop. "There are people who—" "Don't," she said. The single word came out with a weight she hadn't planned. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he said the call sign again, and this time it didn't land like a word. It landed like a set of coordinates, like being handed a map of a place she had promised herself she was done going back to. She straightened the bay curtain, turned, and walked out before he could say anything else. At the nursing station, she sat down and opened the chart, logged the vitals, the interventions, the timeline. Her handwriting didn't waver. It never did. She had trained that out of herself a long time ago, the waver. She finished the entry, closed the chart, sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. The man knew her call sign. He had spent 3 months locating her specifically, and whatever he had started to say before she cut him off. There are people who— That sentence had not been going anywhere good. She had been in Crestfield for 4 years, built a quiet life, kept her head down, paid attention to the work, and let everything else stay buried. And somewhere in the last 4 years, someone had been looking. She stood up, clocked the charge nurse across the station, said she was going to check on a patient in 3 East, and took the elevator up. In the small metal box of the elevator, she stood alone and let her back rest against the wall and counted her breaths. 4 in, hold 4, out 4. A count she had learned in a room that looked nothing like this hospital, taught to her by a man she hadn't thought about in years, for situations that had also looked nothing like this. The elevator opened on 3. She walked out into the corridor and turned toward the east wing. The hallway was dim and mostly empty at this hour. A housekeeper moving a cart near the far end, a resident in rumpled scrubs coming out of a call room, the usual nighttime skeleton of a hospital floor. She was halfway to the nursing station when the door on her left opened. Supply closet. Standard metal door said the kind that's on every floor. She had walked past it hundreds of times. A man in a gray jacket stepped out. He looked directly at her, 1 second, maybe less, and then looked away and walked in the opposite direction, toward the stairwell. She gave herself 3 more steps before she let herself process what she had just seen. The way he'd been standing when the door opened, he hadn't been accessing supplies. The jacket hung wrong on the left side, the particular kind of wrong that came from something carried in an inside pocket that had weight and a specific shape. His gaze had been assessing, not accidental. And his walk, economical, weight slightly forward, the kind of movement pattern that was trained into a body over a long time until it became the default, was not the walk of a hospital employee. She had seen that posture in exactly one kind of context. She kept walking, reached the nursing station, picked up a chart she didn't need, stood there for a moment with the chart open in her hands and her eyes tracking the corridor behind her in the reflection of the darkened window across the hall. The man in the gray jacket had reached the stairwell door. He pushed it open without looking back. The door closed. Simone set the chart down. The dying man downstairs had said it wasn't random, had said there were people, and then she had cut him off. And now she was standing on a dim hospital floor at 10:15 at night, and a man who moved like he'd been somewhere she recognized had just stepped out of a supply closet and walked away like he owned the geometry of the building. She was good at absorbing things. She had been doing it for years. She was good at keeping her head down and letting the world's noise wash over her without letting it in. But her pulse was doing something right now that it had not done in 6 years. It was doing what it used to do in the seconds before a situation stopped being something you watched and became something you survived. She gave herself until the end of the corridor to decide what to do about it, and by the time she reached the nursing station at the far end, she had decided nothing. Not yet. That was the discipline. Not the ignoring, she was not ignoring it, but the containment. You take the information in, you hold it, you don't act on it until you know enough to act correctly. Reacting fast to incomplete data was how people got killed. She had learned that in conditions that made a dim hospital hallway look like a vacation, and the lesson had stuck. She picked up a legitimate chart this time, checked in on the patient in 3 East who actually needed a vitals check, documented it, and walked back to the elevator at the same pace she always walked, unhurried, unremarkable. The gray jacket man was gone. The stairwell door was closed. The floor looked exactly like a hospital floor at 10:20 at night was supposed to look. She rode back down to the ER. Downstairs, the department had shifted into its late-night rhythm, quieter than peak hours, but never actually quiet. A low-grade constant hum of minor crises and waiting rooms, and the particular exhaustion that settled over staff somewhere around the 10 p.m. mark. The trauma bay where the patient had come in was being cleaned and reset. Holt was already scrubbed in upstairs. She'd confirmed that before she left. She sat at the nursing station and pulled up the patient's intake record. Name listed as Victor Saab, age 44. No listed next of kin. No insurance card. The paramedics had picked him up 3 blocks from the Hargrove parking structure, called in by a pedestrian who found him on the sidewalk, already down. No weapon recovered. No witnesses beyond the one who'd called it in, and that person had given a first name only and left before the unit arrived. She read it twice, looked at the address field, which was blank, looked at the emergency contact field, which was also blank. Victor Saab. She didn't know that name. It didn't connect to anything she recognized, but the scar on his temple connected to something, and the call sign connected to something, and 3 months of someone looking for her connected to something, and whatever those somethings added up to, they were not adding up to coincidence. She closed the record, stood up, and went back to work. The next 2 hours were standard ER. A laceration in Bay 3 that needed 12 stitches, an elderly man with chest pain who turned out to be anxiety and a pulled muscle, a teenager who had mixed things she shouldn't have mixed at a party and needed monitoring and fluids, and someone to sit with her until the worst of it passed. Simone did all of it. She was thorough and she was present, and she did not let herself think about the stairwell door or Victor Saab or the word that had come out of his mouth in the trauma bay. She almost managed it. Just past midnight, the charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Greta, who had been running ER floors since before Simone had started nursing school, appeared at her elbow with an expression that Simone had learned to read as trouble wearing a professional face. "Holt wants to see you," Greta said. His office, when you've got a clear moment. What for? Greta's mouth did something that wasn't quite a wince. He didn't explain it to me. That was its own kind of answer. Simone checked on her current patient, confirmed the teenager's vitals were stable, and a second nurse could cover the next check, and walked down the corridor toward the administrative wing. Holt's office was at the end of a hallway that got progressively quieter as you moved through it, which Simone had always thought was deliberate. He was sitting behind his desk when she knocked and pushed the door open, still in his scrubs, post-surgery, with the kind of controlled stillness that meant he'd had time to get his face in order before she arrived. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Sit down." She didn't. She stood just inside the door with her hands at her sides, and she watched him register the fact that she hadn't sat down, and she watched him decide not to make an issue of it. "The patient is stable," he said. "Surgery went well." "Good. Your read on the hemorrhage was correct." He said it the way someone says a thing they have practiced saying, flat and fast, like if it moved quickly enough it wouldn't leave a mark. "The hemodiaphragm was compromised. We repaired it." "Okay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he had expected from that admission, she wasn't giving it to him. "What I want to understand," he said, "is how a floor nurse identified a hemidiaphragm bleed from across a trauma bay on a visual read without imaging in under 20 seconds. "Experience," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Holt leaned back in his chair. The look he gave her was measuring, not angry anymore, or not only angry, curious in the way that people are curious when something doesn't fit the category they put it in, and they're not sure whether to reclassify the thing or push harder on the category. "Where did you train? Before the county center?" "My resume is on file with HR." "I read it. It has gaps." She held his gaze and didn't offer anything to fill the silence. "You realize," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, "that what happened tonight in the trauma bay, you undermining the attending physician's assessment in front of the entire team, that's a protocol violation, regardless of outcome." There it was. She had known it was coming, had known it from the moment she'd spoken across the bay. That was the deal she had made with herself when she spoke. She would be right. She would probably save the man's life, and then someone would come for her later with paperwork. It was a transaction she had entered with her eyes open. "I documented the intervention in the chart," she said, time-stamped. "That's not the point. The patient's alive, that's the point." "Nurse Voss." His voice was not raised, but it was precise. "I'm telling you, as the attending physician and as the director of this trauma program, that what you did tonight created a serious problem for the department. I'm not going to pretend it didn't because the outcome was good. Outcomes don't retroactively justify process violations." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside in the hall, someone wheeled something past on a cart. The fluorescent light above his desk had a slight buzz that she hadn't noticed when she first came in and now couldn't stop noticing. "Are you suspending me?" she asked. "I'm documenting a formal reprimand. You'll go before the nursing review committee on Friday." He opened a folder on his desk. It was already prepared, she noted. He had done this before she came in. "In the meantime, you're restricted to non-critical patient care. No trauma clearance. No bay access without direct physician supervision." She almost said something then. She had several things available to say, and some of them were true, and some of them would have felt good, and none of them would have helped her. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds and let the things she wasn't going to say move through her and pass. "Understood," she said. She walked out and closed the door behind her. Back at the nursing station, she sat down and pulled the next chart off the stack and started reading it, because the work was still there, and the work didn't care what had just happened in that office. And somewhere above her on the surgical floor, Victor Saab was in recovery, and she still didn't know why he'd spent 3 months finding her, or who was behind the man in the gray jacket, and she needed more information before any of it could be useful. But the reprimand was coming. The committee review was Friday, and Holt would write the narrative between now and then, because that was how it worked. The person with the title wrote the story, and everyone else existed inside whatever version of events the title holder decided was accurate. She had been here before. Not in this building, but in this exact situation. She had been the person with the right answer and the wrong credential, and she had watched someone else take the answer and use it, and then turn around and make the using of it into a problem. She knew exactly how that story went. What she was less certain about was how tonight's version ended. She was 2 charts in when the call came down from the surgical floor. The patient in recovery, Victor Saab, was awake, agitated, and asking for her by name. The recovery nurse had tried to settle him, and he had pulled out his own monitoring lead and was refusing to let anyone reattach it until he spoke to the nurse from the ER. The recovery nurse sounded like someone who had been awake for 11 hours and had reached the point where a patient pulling their own leads registered somewhere between baffling and personal. Simone told the charge nurse she was going up. Greta gave her a look that was not quite a warning and not quite sympathy and landed somewhere in the middle of both. She took the stairs. Victor Saab was in a curtained recovery bay, sitting partially upright at an angle that was going to hurt him tomorrow, arms crossed over his hospital gown like someone who had made a decision. The monitoring lead he'd pulled was still dangling from the bed rail. His color was better than it had been. The surgery had done what surgery was supposed to do, but he was pale in the particular way that people are pale when they've been opened up and closed back together. And there were deep lines around his mouth that she didn't think were all from tonight. She pulled the curtain closed behind her. "You need to lie back down," she said. "I need 60 seconds," he said. "Actual 60 seconds. No interruptions." She looked at him. He looked back. She had looked at this face before, across a distance, in worse light, in a context she had spent 6 years not thinking about, and she knew what the expression on it meant. He was not going to lie back down until he had said what he needed to say. She crossed her arms and waited. "My name isn't Victor Saab," he said. "You probably already ran the intake record." "I did." "My actual name is Garrison Okafor. I was a team lead with the 4th Specialized Operations Group Bravo element before my discharge." He paused, swallowed. The effort of talking was clearly costing him more than he was letting show. "You were attached to Bravo element for 14 months. Raven assignment. 2016 through part of 2017. She didn't say anything. "Kandahar. The hospital ambush in September. 3 of ours were hit, and you kept all 3 of them alive for 6 hours with what was basically a trauma kit and a field tourniquet and whatever you could improvise. One of them was me." He looked at her steadily. "I was the one with the femoral. You made a tourniquet out of a comms cable and a piece of a vehicle door." She remembered. She didn't want to, but she did. "I've been looking for you for 3 months," he said. "Not because I wanted to revisit history, because someone else has been looking for you longer than that, and they're not going to stop, and they're not—" He broke off. His jaw tightened. "They're not the kind of people who stop." "Who?" she said. It came out flat, not like a question. "A man named Dre Mercer, formerly DOD contractor. He went private 4 years ago." Okafor's voice dropped to something she had to lean slightly forward to catch. "He's been building a dossier on every operative and attached specialist from the classified programs between 2014 and 2019. People like you. People whose names weren't supposed to exist on paper. He's been selling the information." The recovery bay was very quiet. "Selling it to who?" she said. "People who have reasons to want those names. Some of them are foreign, some of them aren't." He held her gaze. "2 people from the programs are already dead. One in Phoenix, one in Raleigh. Both ruled accidents. I was in contact with a federal task force working the Mercer case when someone shot me in a parking garage 3 hours before my scheduled debrief." She was very still. "The man who shot me followed me here," Okafor said. "He's still in this building." The curtain moved. Not much. A shift. A settling. The kind of movement that could be air from a vent or someone passing in the corridor. But she had positioned herself facing the curtain when she came in, and she had been tracking the gap at the bottom since she sat down, and she had not seen feet pass in the corridor in the last 4 minutes. Until now. 1 pair, stationary, just beyond the curtain on the right side. She kept her eyes on Okafor and her voice completely level. "What color was the jacket?" she said. Something moved in his face. Recognition, relief. The specific relief of someone who has spent a long time hoping a person would still be who they remembered and has just received confirmation. "Gray," he said. She straightened slowly, turned so her back was no longer to the curtain. "You need to press the call button," she said, "and tell whoever answers that you're in pain and you need the doctor. You're going to stay loud and you're going to stay in this bed no matter what you hear. Understood?" "Simone." "Understood." He reached for the call button. "Yeah," he said. She walked to the curtain and pushed through it fast, not running, not telegraphing, just moving with the velocity of someone who has a reason to go somewhere, and the corridor was empty except for a housekeeping cart parked against the far wall and a recovery room nurse 30 feet away at the station with her back turned. She turned left. Checked the corridor right. Nothing. Then she heard the stairwell door at the end of the hall click shut. She went after it. The stairwell was institutional concrete and fluorescent strip lighting, the kind of space that amplified sound and gave it nowhere to go. She pushed through the door and stood at the top of the first landing and listened. Footsteps below, descending, steady and not fast. Deliberately, not fast. Someone who didn't want to sound like they were running. She went down. Third floor landing. Second. She came around the turn on the second floor landing and the man in the gray jacket was there, one hand on the railing, and he had stopped moving. And when she came around the corner, he turned and looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He was younger than she'd initially clocked. Early 30s. Wide through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual use rather than a gym. The left pocket of the jacket hung wrong exactly the way she had noted upstairs. "You've been in that building for how long?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Long enough." "Who sent you?" "I think you know." She held her position on the landing, 3 steps above him. "I'm going to ask you one more time, then I'm going to call security. Tell them there's a non-staff individual who accessed a restricted floor without authorization, and let this building handle it. You want to answer my question, or you want to answer theirs?" Something moved across his expression. Not fear. He wasn't afraid of her, and she wasn't trying to make him afraid, she was trying to make him calculate. There was a difference. "My name is Declan Rourke," he said. "Federal Task Force. Mercer Investigation." He reached slowly into his right jacket pocket, right, not left, and produced a credentials wallet, which he held out flat in his palm without moving toward her. She didn't move toward it either. She looked at it from where she was. "The man in 3 East gave you my name," she said. "He gave us your location 6 weeks ago." Rourke put the credentials away. "We've been watching the building since Monday. We knew Mercer's contractor followed Okafor here. We needed to confirm before we could move." "You confirmed it," she said. "You're moving now?" "We're trying to." His voice was level, carefully neutral in the way that trained people were neutral when they were managing a conversation they couldn't afford to lose. "The contractor who shot Okafor is somewhere in this building. We have 2 agents outside. We need to lock down the floor and move Okafor to a secure location, and we need to do it without alerting the contractor before we have a position on him." He looked at her directly. "And we need someone who knows this building's layout and can move through it without drawing attention." The stairwell hum was very loud in the silence after that. "You came here to ask me to help you," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Okafor said you were the best he'd ever worked with," Rourke said. "He also said you'd say no. But here you are, in a stairwell instead of calling security, so." She looked at him for a long moment. There was a version of this where she called security anyway, where she walked back upstairs and wrote up the encounter and let the federal machinery handle itself without her inside it. She had built a life in this city out of exactly that kind of stepping back. 4 years of it. The stepping back had cost her things she didn't fully inventory, but it had also kept her intact and unremarkable, and not in any stairwells talking to task force agents about contractors who had shot a man she'd kept alive with a comms cable. But Okafor had said 2 people were already dead. Phoenix, Raleigh. And the man who shot him was somewhere in this hospital right now, in a building with patients and beds and nurses who didn't know anything was wrong. And Rourke had 2 agents outside and a contractor somewhere inside, and no one who knew the layout of the floors and which service corridors connected which wings and where the blind spots in the security camera coverage were. She did know. She had spent 4 years learning this building the way she learned every environment she spent significant time in. Not deliberately, not as preparation, just because that was how her brain worked and she had long since stopped fighting it. She took a breath. "4th floor has a service corridor that runs between the east and west wings," she said. "It's not on the standard map. Maintenance access. If he's trying to move between floors without using the main elevators or the stairwells that are on camera, that's his route." Rourke went very still. "How confident are you?" "Completely." He pulled out a radio, keyed it twice. spoke quietly. She caught enough to know he was repositioning his agents. "Okay," she said, "here's what we're going to do." And even as she said it, even as something in her chest shifted and settled into a shape she hadn't felt in 6 years, a shape that was not comfortable exactly, but was unmistakable, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a partial failure. Every light in the stairwell went black at once, and a half-second later she heard the distant clunk of the hospital's emergency system switching over, and the backup generators caught and threw the building into the particular amber red of emergency power. And somewhere above them an alarm began cycling. And in the new dark and the alarm and the low emergency glow, Rourke's radio came to life with a voice she didn't recognize, saying 2 words with a very specific kind of urgency. "He's moving." Simone was already moving before Rourke finished keying his radio. The emergency lighting turned the stairwell into something amber and unfamiliar, shadows landing in the wrong places. The geometry of the space slightly altered by the color shift. She went up, not down, because down was the way someone running would go, and the contractor was not running. Rourke's agent had said moving, not fleeing, which meant deliberate, which meant he had a destination. "4th floor service corridor," she said without looking back. Now, Rourke was right behind her. She could hear him relaying into the radio in short bursts. Positions, floor numbers, the service corridor location she had just given him, while she took the stairs at a pace that was fast but controlled, one hand skimming the railing for orientation in the half-dark. 3 flights. The alarm cycling above them had shifted pitch, which meant someone in the hospital's control room had upgraded the power failure to an internal emergency. That was going to bring more personnel into the corridors. More personnel meant more civilians in unpredictable positions. She pushed through the 4th floor door and stopped immediately. The service corridor end entrance was 12 feet to her left, an unmarked metal door with a keypad, the kind of access point that didn't appear on the public floor maps and that most of the clinical staff treated as invisible because it had nothing to do with patient care. She had noticed it 8 months into her time at Hargrove, during a period when the East Wing elevator was down for 3 weeks, and she had started mapping alternative routes between floors out of the same idle, automatic habit that made her clock a room's exits before she sat down in it. She went to the door. The keypad was dark. Backup power hadn't reached the system yet. "Locked," she said. "Can you get through it?" She looked at the panel. Standard magnetic lock, fail secure configuration, which meant a power failure would keep it locked rather than releasing it. The backup generator had restored power to lighting and life support systems, but secondary access controls were lower priority. This door was going to stay locked until someone with building authority manually overrode it or the main power came back. "Not fast enough," she said. "Other side. There's a maintenance access point from the east stairwell. Different keypad, separate circuit." She was already moving back toward the stairwell. It was active during the elevator outage last year. If it's on the same backup circuit as the East Wing systems, it'll be live. Rourke spoke into the radio again. She caught the response. One of his agents was on the 2nd floor, the other was covering the main entrance. Neither was positioned for the 4th floor east stairwell. He relayed the location and got back an ETA that she knew was too long. "We go in without them," she said. "You're not armed." "I know." She pushed through the stairwell door and started moving east along the exterior corridor. "Neither is he, probably. Bringing a firearm into a hospital after already using one tonight would be a significant risk. If his objective is Okafor and he's a professional, he's looking for something he can make look like a medical error. Something quiet." Rourke was quiet for a moment, keeping pace beside her. "How do you know he hasn't already accessed Okafor's room from a different route?" "I don't," she said. "But Okafor is in surgical recovery, which is on the 3rd floor, not the 4th. The service corridor on 4 connects to the medication distribution hub for 3 East. If you wanted to source something that would stop a post-surgical patient's heart without leaving obvious evidence, that's where you'd start." She could feel Rourke processing that. "You've thought about this before," he said. "Not an accusation, just an observation." "I think about a lot of things," she said. Left. The east stairwell access point was a slightly different configuration. The keypad here was mounted higher, the panel older, and when she pressed her hand flat against it, she felt the faint vibration of current. Active. She punched in the maintenance override code she had memorized 11 months ago from a laminated card she had seen a facilities technician use and never forgotten. Because she never forgot numbers, and the panel beeped once, and the lock disengaged. Rourke looked at her. I read a lot, she said, and pushed the door open. The service corridor on the fourth floor was narrow and industrial. Concrete walls, exposed conduit running along the ceiling, the ambient noise of the building's mechanical systems louder here than anywhere else. The emergency lighting had reached this section. Amber strips along the baseboard threw enough light to move by, but not enough to see far ahead. The corridor ran roughly 40 feet before branching, one arm continuing east toward the elevator mechanical room, the other dropping down a half flight to the third-floor distribution hub. She stopped at the branch and listened. The mechanical noise was constant and masking. She filtered it the way she had learned to filter ambient sound in environments where ambient sound was covering other things, not listening for specific sounds, but for the absence of the baseline, the irregularities in the pattern. There. A sound that didn't belong, brief. Below them and to the right, something placed on a hard surface. She went down the half-flight without speaking. Rourke followed. The lower section of the corridor was shorter, ending at a heavy door with a wire glass window. Through the glass, she could see the distribution hub, a room roughly the size of a large office, shelves of pharmaceutical stock along 3 walls, 2 automated dispensing units against the far wall, and a figure in dark clothing at the nearer dispensing unit with a pen light in one hand and something else in the other. She did not recognize the face from this angle, but the jacket was not gray. He had changed. He switched jackets, she said quietly. He's prepared. Rourke had his hand on the door. On your call. She looked through the glass for 2 more seconds. The man at the dispensing unit had the cabinet open. He was working efficiently and without panic, which meant he was experienced, which meant going in loud was going to accelerate whatever his timeline was rather than interrupt it. She needed him away from the cabinet and in the open. Give me your radio, she said. Rourke hesitated. 2 seconds. Then he handed it over. She keyed it once, producing a burst of static loud enough to be heard through the door, and stepped back from the window. The figure inside went still, turned toward the door. In that moment, she saw his face clearly for the first time and did not know it, which meant he had not been part of any program she had directly worked with, which told her he was contracted rather than converted. Someone hired for this specific job rather than someone with his own history in the system. That was useful information. Contracted operatives had a mission profile and a payment structure and a risk threshold. They were professionals, but professionals with a ceiling. He moved toward the door. She positioned herself flat against the corridor wall to the left of the door, outside his sightline through the window. Rourke took the right side. The door swung outward, toward Rourke's side, and the man came through leading with his right shoulder, penlight in his left hand, and a syringe in his right. Rourke moved first. He caught the syringe hand at the wrist and turned it outward and down, which was correct. You controlled the hand with the instrument first, everything else second. But the man was faster than Rourke had anticipated, which she had anticipated, and he used the outward momentum to rotate his body and get his left elbow into Rourke's ribs. Rourke lost a step. Not much. Enough. Simone came off the wall and took the man's left arm at the elbow with both hands, used the rotation he was already committed to, and redirected it, not fighting the direction of the movement, but adding to it, past the angle where it was useful to him and into the angle where it wasn't. He hit the corridor wall shoulder first. The penlight went. The syringe stayed in Rourke's grip. The man recovered faster than she would have liked. He was good. He came back off the wall with his hands up and his weight correctly distributed and his face completely controlled, which was the most alarming thing about him. No panic, no escalation of expression, just recalibration. Stop, she said. Her voice was very calm. He looked at her. Not at Rourke, who had the syringe and the authority and the federal credentials. At her. You're the one he came to find, the man said. His accent was flat, mid-American, the accent of someone who had trained the origin out of their voice. You're Raven. I was, she said. Mercer wants the full dossier confirmed. You're the last name. Then Mercer's going to be disappointed, she said, because you're done. He moved, left, fast, toward the gap between her and the wall, and she moved with it, and she was not as fast as she had been at 28, and she knew that, but she was smarter than she had been at 28, and she had positioned herself during the conversation for exactly this direction, and when he tried to go through the gap, she closed it and used the door frame and his own speed, and it was not clean. It was not anything close to clean. She took a forearm across the left side of her face that she felt immediately in the back of her teeth. But he went down, and she stayed up, and Rourke was on him in the next 2 seconds with a knee and both wrists. The corridor was loud with breathing. She stood back and put her hand to her face. Her cheekbone was going to be spectacular in an hour. She ran her tongue across the inside of her left cheek and tasted blood where the impact had driven her cheek against her own teeth and decided that was acceptable. "You okay?" Rourke said. He had the man face down and controlled. "I've had worse." She looked at the syringe still in Rourke's other hand. "What is that?" "I'll need a lab to confirm, but based on where he was in the dispensing unit," Rourke looked up at her. "Potassium chloride, probably. Drawn from a ward stock vial. Administered in a post-surgical patient, it would read as cardiac arrest. Believable. Documentable as a complication." She looked at the syringe for a moment. Then she looked at the man on the floor, who had stopped moving but was not cooperative. His body was passive in the specific way of someone waiting for an opportunity rather than someone who had given up. "Your agents are going to take another 4 minutes," she said to Rourke. "You need something to secure him with, and you can't leave him to go get it." "I know." She unclipped the badge lanyard from around her own neck and crouched down. "Give me his left hand." Rourke gave her the hand. She used the lanyard around both wrists. It wasn't cuffs, it wasn't going to hold if he really committed to getting out of it, but it created a problem he'd have to visibly work on, which bought them time. She stood back up. "The room," she said. "Does any of the stock need to be secured? If he pulled vials, we'll lock it down when the agents arrive. Don't touch anything in there." Rourke looked at her steadily. "The whole room is evidence now." She nodded. They waited. The alarm above them was still cycling. The man on the floor breathed steadily and didn't try the lanyard and watched the middle distance with the expression of someone doing internal arithmetic. Rourke's agents came through the east stairwell access in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, not 4. They were efficient and said little and had proper restraints, and when they took over, Rourke stepped back and let them handle the room without narrating it. Simone walked back up the half-flight to the main service corridor and stopped and stood still for a moment in the amber light. Her face hurt. Her hands were steady. Somewhere below her, Garrison Okafor was in recovery with a call button and a nurse who would have responded to the call by now, and a situation he had no way to explain without revealing things she still didn't know the full scope of. She took a breath and thought about what Rourke had said. Last name. She was the last name on the dossier. T. That meant Mercer's list was almost complete. That meant whatever Mercer planned to do with the list, sell it, leverage it, use it as currency in some arrangement she couldn't see from where she was standing, was close to ready. And it meant that the contractor on the floor below her was not the only one who knew she was in this building tonight. Rourke came up the half-flight and stood beside her. "We need to move Okafor," she said. "Already in motion. I've called for transport." He looked at her cheek. "You should have someone look at that." "I will." She paused. "What happens to me now?" It wasn't a frightened question. She asked it the way she asked clinical questions, directly, without softening it, because the answer was going to be the answer regardless of how she asked it. Rourke took a moment. "The task force is going to need a formal statement. Your history, your connection to Okafor, what you observed tonight, that becomes part of the case file. And my name goes into protected status. That's not a favor. That's protocol for witnesses with operational backgrounds in active federal investigations." He met her eyes. "Nobody publishes your history without your consent. That's the law." "People who sent that contractor know the law too," she said. "Yes," he said. "They do." He didn't dress it up. She appreciated that. She walked back toward the door to the main corridor, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Mercer, where is he right now?" "We don't know exactly. We know he's in the country. We know the transaction, the dossier sale, was scheduled for within the week." Rourke's voice was careful. "That's what Okafor was bringing to the debrief when he was shot. A week. The sale was within a week. And the final name on the list was hers. And the man who had been sent to confirm it was currently zip-tied on a concrete floor 1 level below her. Mercer would know his contractor had missed within hours, maybe sooner. She pushed the door open and walked out into the amber-lit corridor of the 4th floor. And above her the alarm was still cycling, and below her this hospital was full of patients and staff who had no idea what had just happened 40 feet above their heads, in a service corridor that didn't appear on any public map. Her scrub cap had come off somewhere in the corridor. She didn't know when. She walked to the east elevator bank and pressed the button for the third floor and stood waiting, and her cheek was throbbing now with the kind of deep bone ache that meant she was going to need imaging to confirm nothing was cracked, and she was making a mental note to handle that before the end of the shift when the elevator doors opened, and Dr. Marcus Holt was standing in it. He looked at her face. The elevator was lit by the amber emergency power, everything slightly wrong, slightly other-colored. And even in that light, the bruising coming up under her left eye was visible, and the small cut on the inside of her lip that she could feel but couldn't close was visible. And he looked at all of it with the expression of a man who has encountered a fact about a person that doesn't fit any category he had for them. "What happened to your face?" he said. She stepped into the elevator. "I need to check on a patient," she said. "Nurse Voss." "I'm going to check on my patient," she said again. "Then I'll explain." The doors closed. Holt stood beside her in the elevator and did not speak, which was the right decision even if he had arrived at it for the wrong reasons, and she kept her eyes on the floor numbers and breathed steadily and thought about Mercer and a dossier that was nearly complete and a sale scheduled within the week, and what it meant that the last name on the list was hers. The elevator stopped on 3. She stepped out first, down the recovery corridor, past the nursing station where the night staff looked up and looked back down without commenting on her face because emergency power was still running and everyone was managing their own piece of the crisis, and there was no bandwidth left for other people's situations. She pushed through the recovery bay curtain. Okafor was upright in the bed and the monitoring lead was reattached, and a nurse she didn't recognize was on the far side of the curtain talking to someone in a low voice. He looked at her when she came in, and his eyes went immediately to her face. "The other guy," she said before he could ask. "He's in federal custody, 1 floor up." Some of the tension in his shoulders came down. "Not all of it. Rourke's moving you tonight," she said. "Secure transport. You'll be out of this hospital within the hour." "And you?" She pulled the chair beside the bed and sat down. Her legs were tired in a way she hadn't noticed until she stopped moving. "Statement tomorrow. Protected status for the case file." She looked at him. "You could have led with all of this. When you first found me, instead of walking into my ER and getting yourself shot." "I wasn't planning on the getting shot part," he said. His voice was dry despite everything. "And I didn't know if you'd hear me out. 6 years, Simone. You disappeared completely. I thought—" He stopped, reorganized. "I thought you might not want to be found." "I didn't," she said. "I know. But you found me anyway." "2 people from the unit are dead," he said quietly. "I didn't have the luxury of respecting your preference." She sat with that for a moment. It was honest, which she respected, and it was also an explanation of the exact kind of thinking that had defined the work she used to do. Mission over preference, objective over comfort, the thing that needed to happen over the thing you wanted. She had believed in it once. She wasn't sure anymore whether she still did. "When this is over," she said, "when the statement is filed and the case is built, and my name is whatever protected status it's going to be, I come back here, to this job, to this city." Okafor looked at her steadily. "That's what you want?" "That's what I'm telling you." He nodded once. Didn't push. The curtain moved and Rourke was there with a second agent behind him, and the movement in the recovery ward picked up immediately. Voices, wheels, the coordinated shuffle of a patient being prepared for rapid transfer. Simone stood up and got out of the way, because there was nothing more she needed to do in this room, and Rourke's people were competent, and Okafor was in better hands than hers now. She walked back out to the recovery corridor. Holt was standing at the nursing station. He had followed her down. She hadn't noticed. He was standing with his arms crossed and his back against the counter, watching her emerge from the recovery bay. And the look on his face was the look of a man who has been holding a conversation in his head and has not yet decided whether to have it out loud. She stopped in front of him. "The patient in recovery bay 4, he said. "The men in the service corridor." He paused. "Greta told me there were federal agents in the building." "Yes," she said. "Are you going to tell me what's happening in my hospital?" She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't in 4 years of working in his department, because looking directly at people in authority had always seemed like an invitation she didn't want to extend. He was tired. She could see it now in a way that the normal dynamics of the floor kept hidden. The surgery had been long, the power failure had hit while he was mid-procedure, and he had managed all of it with the competence she had always acknowledged, even when everything else about him frustrated her. He was not a bad surgeon. He had never been a bad surgeon. He was just a man who had spent 12 years being the most important person in every room, and that had done what it always did to people. "I'll explain," she said. "All of it, but not here and not right now." She held his eyes. "Your patient is stable. The situation in the building is controlled. The review committee on Friday. You're going to want to cancel it." He stared at her. "Excuse me." "You're going to want to cancel it," she said again. "That's my recommendation." And before he could respond, the lights came back on. Not the amber emergency power. The real lights. Full spectrum. Institutional white. Every fluorescent bar on the recovery floor blazing back to life simultaneously in a way that made everyone in the corridor flinch and blink. The alarm cut off mid-cycle. The building's systems began their restoration sequence, the quiet clicks and hums of equipment returning to normal operational status, moving through the walls like a wave. In the sudden brightness, in the silence left by the alarm's absence, Simone stood in the recovery corridor with bruising climbing the left side of her face and blood drying at the corner of her lip and her scrub cap missing, and every person on the floor was looking at her. Holt was looking at her. The recovery nurses were looking at her. Two of Rourke's agents, pushing Okafor's transfer gurney out of the bay and toward the elevator, paused and looked at her. And Okafor, flat on the gurney with an IV line and a monitor pack and a federal escort, turned his head as they passed. "Raven," he said. Not loud, not performing it for the room, just saying it, the way you say the name of something you're glad is still in the world. The agents pushed the gurney forward. The elevator doors opened. Holt looked at her and said nothing, which was the most unsettled she had ever seen him. She turned toward the nursing station and picked up a chart. Reflex muscle memory, the habit of 4 years. Her hands were not shaking. Her face was a problem she would deal with shortly. The floor was coming back online around her, staff returning to tasks, the institutional rhythm reasserting itself over the chaos of the last hour. But at the nursing station's computer, half visible in the reflection of the dark screen before it powered back up, she caught something that made her go still. A notification. Internal hospital system. Flagged urgent, sender ID from the hospital's administrative office, time-stamped 4 minutes ago, during the power outage, which meant it had been queued and delivered the moment the system came back online. Subject line. Nursing Review Committee. Accelerated hearing request. She opened it. It was not a cancellation. It was a rescheduled hearing. Not Friday. Tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. And attached to the request was a secondary document, a formal complaint filed not by Holt, but by someone she had never heard of. A name she didn't recognize in the administrative structure. Filed under a clause she had never seen invoked in 4 years at this hospital. A clause about staff with undisclosed prior employment in sensitive government or military roles. Someone had been in the hospital's HR system tonight. Someone who already knew what she was. She read the document twice, felt the weight of it settle somewhere below her sternum. Not fear, not quite, but the thing adjacent to fear that was also adjacent to clarity. The thing that meant the situation had just changed shape. Mercer hadn't waited for his contractor to report back. He had already moved. She read the document a third time and then closed the screen. The name on the complaint was Theodore Vane, administrative liaison according to the title field. She had never encountered that name in 4 years at Hargrove, which meant either the position was new or the position had been created for exactly this purpose, and both of those possibilities pointed the same direction. She pulled out her phone and texted Rourke a single line. Someone filed an HR complaint against me using my classified background as grounds. Check the name Theodore Vane. Hospital admin system, timestamped during the outage. His response came back in under 90 seconds. On it. Don't attend that hearing. She put the phone away and looked at the clock above the nursing station. 2:41 a.m. The floor had mostly restabilized, staff back at tasks. The particular post-crisis quiet that settled over a hospital after something dramatic had passed without turning into a catastrophe. She could feel the tiredness in the back of her skull that came not from physical exhaustion alone, but from the specific kind of cognitive load that came with running two completely different tracks simultaneously for hours. Her cheek needed imaging. She knew that. She was going to handle it, and she was going to document it, and she was going to finish the shift, because leaving early would look like exactly the kind of retreat that the complaint was designed to provoke. She walked to the supply room, pulled a cold pack, cracked it, and held it to her face while she sat in the break room for 7 minutes, and drank half a cup of cold coffee that someone had left in the pot. The break room was empty. The fluorescent light buzzed. She sat with the cold pack and the bad coffee and let herself be tired for exactly those 7 minutes, and then she stood up, threw the cup away, and went back to work. Greta found her at 5:15. The charge nurse came to the station where Simone was updating charts, and stood with her arms crossed, and the look of someone who had been deciding for a while whether to say a thing and had finally decided. "Holt asked me what I knew about you," Greta said, "about your background." "What did you tell him?" "That you were the best nurse on my floor, and I didn't know anything else." She paused. "Which is true, as far as it goes." Simone kept her eyes on the chart. "He's going to find out more than that." "I figured." Greta's voice dropped slightly. "There are 2 people I don't recognize sitting in the main lobby. They've been there since about 2 a.m. They're not patients, and they're not waiting for patients, and they haven't spoken to anyone at the desk." Simone looked up. "I'm just telling you what I see," Greta said. "Thank you," Simone said, and meant it. Greta walked away without asking any follow-up questions, which was one of the things that had always made her good at her job. Simone texted Rourke again. 2 individuals, main lobby, stationary since approximately 200, non-clinical. His response this time took 4 minutes. "We see them. Do not approach. Shift ends at 700, correct?" "Yes." "Have someone walk you out. Not alone." She set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the charts. The shift ended at 7:12. Late because the outgoing charge nurse was running behind, and the handoff took longer than usual, the night's events requiring more documentation than a standard shift. Simone briefed the incoming nurse on each patient methodically, answered questions, confirmed everything was charted correctly, and then changed out of her scrubs in the locker room while Della watched her with the studied non-expression of someone exercising considerable restraint. "You going to tell me what happened to your face?" Della said finally. "Rough night." "Simone." She looked at Della in the mirror over the sink. Della had been at Hargrove for 9 years and had seen most things and was not easily rattled, and was also, Simone had understood for a long time, genuinely kind in the specific way that was not the same as soft. "I'm okay," Simone said. "It's going to get complicated for a while, but I'm okay." Della held her eyes for a moment in the mirror. "Okay," she said, and went back to her locker. Priya walked Simone to the parking structure without being asked, which told Simone that Greta had said something, which told her that Greta's loyalty operated along lines that she had apparently earned without realizing it. The morning air outside was cool and gray, the city just beginning its early sounds. Distant traffic, a delivery truck, birds that hadn't gotten the message about urban environments. The 2 figures Greta had flagged in the lobby were gone by the time they came out, which was either because Rourke's people had moved them or because they had accomplished whatever they came to do, and she didn't know yet which it was. She drove home, showered, and sat on the edge of her bed and gave herself 20 minutes of not thinking before her phone rang. Rourke. "Theodore Vane," he said without preamble. "He's not a hospital employee. He's a contractor. Incorporated 14 months ago as a healthcare consultancy, but his actual client list connects back to a shell company in Delaware that we've had flagged for 8 months as a Mercer-adjacent entity." She absorbed that. So Mercer has someone embedded in the hospital's administrative structure. Not embedded. He's been accessing the system remotely. The account was created 6 weeks ago using stolen credentials from a legitimate admin employee. The complaint he filed is fraudulent. The position doesn't exist. Rourke paused. "The problem is that the hospital's board doesn't know that yet. The hearing is still scheduled for 8 a.m., and if you don't appear, it goes to default finding." "I'm not going to appear," she said. "You told me not to." "I know, but I need you to do something else instead." He stopped. She could hear him choosing words. "There's a federal court order coming through in the next 2 hours. It covers Mercer, the dossier, the contractor we took last night, and the fraudulent complaint. It's going to freeze the hearing and trigger a formal review of the hospital's compromised admin access. Another pause. But Mercer knows the order is coming. We think. You think. He has a source. Somewhere in the federal system he has a source, which is how he knew to file that complaint the moment his contractor went dark. He's trying to accelerate the dossier sale before the order lands. She sat with that. How long? She said. The sale is set for tonight. We have a location. A private residence 40 minutes outside Crestfield. We're moving on it at 6 p.m. His voice was careful. I'm not asking you to be there. I'm telling you the timeline so you know what the next 12 hours look like. You're telling me Mercer might complete the transaction before the order lands. I'm telling you we're doing everything we can to prevent that. I'm also telling you that if it goes wrong, if he gets the sale off before we move on the location, the dossier with your name in it hits the open market, and the protected status is considerably harder to maintain. She stood up from the edge of the bed and walked to the window. The morning was fully light now. A neighbor across the street was loading a car. Ordinary. Entirely ordinary. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing dangerous. Okafor wants to give a voluntary statement to the hospital board about your service record, with limited classified details, redacted appropriately. He says you treated him. He says you saved his life, and you have a documented history with the unit that speaks to your character and your competence. That statement, combined with the court order freezing the hearing, is what we use to counter the Mercer complaint before it does permanent damage to your license. Rourke took a breath. But the statement has to come from him today before the board meets informally at noon. He's asking your permission. She looked at the window for a long moment. 6 years of not being that person. 6 years of a life built specifically on the absence of any of this. And now it was sitting in front of her. Not a threat exactly, but an offer. A way to use the past she had put down to protect the present she had built. The thing was, she had earned the present. Every shift, every chart, every patient. She had not been hiding at Hargrove. She had been working, genuinely working, and she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and she had not needed anyone to tell her so. But Holt had filed the reprimand. Mercer had filed the complaint. And if she said nothing and let the board meet at noon with fraudulent paperwork as the only document on the table, the present she had built was gone just as effectively as if she had never built it. Tell him yes, she said. She spent the morning at an urgent care clinic 3 miles from her apartment, where a physician's assistant she had never met took images of her cheekbone, confirmed it was not fractured, prescribed anti-inflammatory medication, and told her to ice it and take it easy for a few days. She said she would. She meant the icing part. At 11 a.m., her phone showed a message from a number she didn't have saved. She opened it anyway. You made a mistake staying in that city. Last chance to walk away from the hearing, walk away from the hospital. We don't need complications. She screenshot it and sent it to Rourke with a single word. Mercer? His response? Almost certainly. Don't respond. This is now evidence. She put the phone down and drove back toward Hargrove. She didn't go inside. She sat in the parking structure at the same level where she always parked and watched the entrance from the car and waited. Because there was nothing she could do inside the building right now, and being visible was not the same as being useful. At 12:43, Rourke called. Board meeting ran long, he said. Okafor's statement was delivered by secure video at noon. The board's legal counsel reviewed the court order, which landed at 12:20. The fraudulent admin account has been flagged and locked. His voice had shifted slightly, less careful, less managed. Something had resolved. The hearing is suspended pending an independent HR investigation into how the compromised credentials were used and what other actions were taken under that account. And the reprimand, she said. Holt's reprimand. Still on file, that's a separate process. The court order doesn't touch internal disciplinary actions. He paused. That one you're going to have to deal with through the hospital's own channels. She had expected that. Mercer, the 6 p.m. operation. Proceeding, we're confident in the location. The careful quality was back in his voice. Don't go anywhere unusual today. Stay available by phone. She ended the call and sat in the parking structure for another few minutes. The afternoon was moving the way afternoons moved after bad nights. Slowly, with everything slightly overbright. Her cheek was a deep ache she had mostly stopped noticing. The cold pack from the break room was long gone. She drove home, and she ate something, and she slept for 3 hours. And at 5:50 p.m., her phone woke her. Not a call. An alert pushed from a local news app she rarely checked. Breaking. Federal agents conduct raid on residents in Crestfield area suburb. Multiple individuals in custody. Investigation ongoing. She sat up and read it twice and then set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. At 6:30, Rourke called. Mercer is in custody. The dossier, full physical and digital copies, is in federal evidence. The sale did not happen. He sounded tired in a way that was not performance. Your name, along with the others on the list, goes into sealed protective documentation. Access is restricted. It will take a federal court order to unseal it. She sat on the edge of the bed. The 2 people who died, she said. Phoenix and Raleigh. Active investigation. Now, with significantly more evidence. He paused. I know that's not a resolution. No, she said. It's not. After she hung up, she sat there for a while. Not long. She was not someone who sat for long. But the moment needed a few minutes to be what it was before she moved through it into whatever came next. What came next was the hospital. She drove to Hargrove at 8 p.m., not because she had a shift. She didn't. Her next shift wasn't until the following evening. But because there were things that needed to be handled in person, and because Greta had texted at 7:53 asking if she was coming in, and the text had the quality of a message from someone who wanted confirmation that a situation was not still deteriorating. She walked into the ER, and it was a Wednesday evening, which meant moderate volume, which meant the floor was busy without being chaotic, which meant nobody had the bandwidth for drama. She went to the nursing station, and Greta looked up and took in the bruising and said nothing about it and handed her a cup of coffee that was actually hot, which was unusual enough to feel deliberate. She was on her second chair minute when the call came from upstairs. Holt's office. Again. She set the coffee down and went up. He was not behind his desk this time. He was standing at the window that looked out over the parking structure and the street beyond it. And he turned when she came in, and he looked worse than he had at 2 a.m. Not physically, but in the way of someone who had spent most of the past several hours being told things they had not known and processing the implications of not having known them. Sit down, he said. She sat. This time. He stood at the window for another moment before he turned fully and leaned against the sill and crossed his arms. The board contacted me at 1 p.m., he said. I was shown Okafor's statement. I was informed of the federal investigation and the fraudulent complaint and the compromised administrative account. He stopped. The jaw muscle worked. I was also informed that the reprimand I filed this morning was the action that gave the fraudulent complaint its entry point, that Vane, or whoever was operating that account, filed against you within hours of my documentation, using my reprimand as the triggering incident to request the accelerated hearing. She had already worked that out. She didn't say so. I didn't know, he said. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. But I want to say it plainly. I did not know I was being used as an instrument in whatever Mercer was doing. I know, she said. You didn't know what I was either. He looked at her directly. What are you? She held his gaze. A nurse, she said. That part was always real. He was quiet for a moment. The reprimand, he said. I'm withdrawing it. I've already filed the withdrawal paperwork. I'm also... He stopped. Something moved in his expression that was not comfortable and was not rehearsed. I'm removing the protocol violation notation from your personnel file. The intervention in the trauma bay was correct. I should have... He stopped again. She waited. I should have listened, he said. In the bay. The first time you spoke. She had not expected that. Not the withdrawal. She'd expected the withdrawal once the board got involved. But that last sentence she had not expected, and she sat with it for a moment before she responded. The patient's alive, she said. That's what mattered. That's not what I said, he said quietly. I said I should have listened. The office was very still. Yes, she said, you should have. He nodded once, the kind of nod that wasn't acknowledgement of agreement, but acknowledgement of a debt. The board is requesting your presence tomorrow morning at 9. Not a hearing, an informal meeting. They want to understand what happened and what your status is going forward. He paused. I'll be there. She stood up. Okay, Voss. He said it before she reached the door. She stopped and looked back. The hemodiaphragm bleed. The approach you used. That's not standard nursing training. That's not even standard emergency medicine. That kind of read. He shook his head slightly. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I wouldn't have caught it that fast. She looked at him across the office. I know, she said, and walked out. In the elevator, she stood alone and pressed the button for the ER floor and felt the day's accumulated weight settle into her bones. The Mercer operation had worked. The dossier was seized. Her name was protected. Okafor was in a secure location recovering from a surgery she had essentially directed before anyone in this building knew she existed. The reprimand was withdrawn. The board wanted to meet. These were good outcomes. She knew they were good outcomes. What she also knew, standing in the elevator as it descended, was that the morning's anonymous text was still on her phone. Walk away from the hearing. Walk away from the hospital. We don't need complications. Mercer was in custody, but the text had said we, not I. We. She had caught it when she read it the first time and filed it and not raised it with Rourke because she'd had nothing to add to it yet, and raising things you couldn't support was not her practice. But it had stayed in the back of her mind all day, a single pronoun that implied a structure larger than one man and his contractor and a dossier. The elevator opened. She stepped out into the ER. At the nursing station, waiting with his arms at his sides and a hospital visitor badge clipped to his jacket, was a man she had never seen before. Late 50s. Gray at the temples. The kind of posture that came from decades of a specific kind of discipline. He looked at her when she came out of the elevator with the immediate recognition of someone who has studied a photograph. He held up a credentials wallet. Different agency. Not the task force. A level above it. Ms. Voss, he said, I'm Deputy Director Harlan Cross. We need to speak privately. He paused. It's not about Mercer. She looked at the credentials. They were real. Then what is it about? She said. He glanced once at the nursing station, at Greta watching from behind the desk, at the ordinary ER evening happening behind both of them. It's about who Mercer was selling to, he said, and why one of the buyers was already in this building 2 hours before his contractor arrived tonight. The floor noise continued around them, monitors and wheels and the ordinary sounds of a hospital at work. Simone stood in the middle of all of it and felt the situation shift shape for the third time in 24 hours. And this time the shape it shifted into was larger than anything she had mapped so far. Follow me, she said, and walked toward the consultation room at the end of the hall. The consultation room at the end of the ER hall was small and poorly lit and smelled like recycled air and old coffee, which made it identical to every other consultation room in every other hospital she had ever worked in. She turned on the overhead light, pulled out 2 chairs from the small table, and sat in the one closest to the door. Old habit. Cross came in and closed the door and did not sit immediately. He looked at the room the way people looked at rooms when they were deciding how much of themselves to put into a conversation, which told her the conversation was going to be more complicated than a simple briefing. He sat down. I'll be direct, he said. Please, she said. Dre Mercer was arrested tonight and his operation is in federal custody. That part you know. He set his credentials wallet on the table between them, face up, not as a reminder of authority, but as a statement of transparency, which she noted. What wasn't disclosed to the task force, and what I'm disclosing to you now, is that we identified 3 buyers for the dossier. 2 were foreign nationals operating through proxies. Those names are part of the sealed evidence package. The 3rd was domestic. Keep on. She waited. The 3rd buyer was already in contact with a source inside Hargrove General, Cross said. Not the contractor, not Vane. A different source, someone with legitimate access to the hospital's internal systems who has been providing information on staff backgrounds for approximately 8 months. Who? She said. Cross looked at her steadily. His name is Raymond Fitch. He was the hospital's director of administrative operations. She did not know that name directly, but she knew the title, and she knew the access that title carried. Personnel files, system credentials, employee records going back years. Everything that Vane had accessed remotely, Fitch could have accessed from inside with complete legitimacy and no visible footprint. He accessed my file, she said. It was not a question. Repeatedly, over the past 4 months. He's also the individual who created the conditions for the compromised admin account. Not Mercer's people. Fitch gave them the access. He was compensated through a series of transactions that our financial crimes unit has been tracing since this morning. Cross leaned forward slightly. He was in this building earlier tonight. We believe he was here to confirm your presence and verify the dossier entry before the sale went through. She thought about the two stationary figures in the lobby that Greta had flagged at 2 a.m. Not Mercer's people watching her. One of them, possibly, had been Fitch, coming to look at what he had sold. Something cold moved through her that was not quite anger and was not quite shock. It was the particular feeling of a betrayal that didn't have a face until it suddenly did. He's been arrested, Cross said, taken into custody at his residence at 7 p.m., approximately 40 minutes after Mercer. His personal devices have been seized. The financial transactions are documented. He paused. I want you to know that the evidence is complete. This is not a case that requires your testimony to hold. You're not being asked to carry any part of this prosecution. She looked at him. Then why are you here? Because you deserve to know who it was, he said, and because he stopped. Something shifted in his expression slightly, something that was not entirely official. Because the people whose names were on that list didn't get to choose whether they were on it. They didn't get to choose whether someone in their civilian workplace was monetizing information about them. The least we can do is tell them who and make sure they hear it from a person rather than a press release. The room was quiet. She had spent 6 years not thinking about what she had done in those 14 months. Not avoiding it. She was not someone who confused avoidance with discipline, but simply not living there. She had moved forward and built something and let the past be the past because the past was finished and the present was where patience needed things, and there was always another chart. But the past had apparently not agreed that it was finished. Is Fitch going to negotiate? She said. His charges. Is he going to try to reduce them by providing information about the buyers? Almost certainly, Cross said. And the sealed protective documentation on the names from the dossier. Does that hold if he starts disclosing in exchange for a deal? Cross was quiet for a moment. The protection on your name is structural. It does not depend on what Fitch says or doesn't say in negotiations. The dossier itself is in federal evidence. Any disclosure of names from it would constitute a separate criminal act. He held her eyes. Your name is protected. I'm telling you that clearly, and I'm telling you it is not contingent. She sat with that. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She stood up. He stood up. They shook hands across the small table in the poorly lit room that smelled like recycled air. And then she opened the door and he walked out ahead of her, and she watched him move through the ER toward the exit. Unhurried, contained, the walk of someone who had delivered a difficult thing and done it as well as it could be done and was now going back to the institution he served. She stood in the doorway of the consultation room for a moment. Raymond Fitch, Director of Administrative Operations. 8 months of accessing her file. Coordinating with Mercer's network from inside the building where she changed into her scrubs every shift and worked through the nights and tried to do something useful with herself. She had been betrayed from the inside by someone she had never met who had decided that her history had a price. And she was furious about it. She could feel the fury, clean and cold, somewhere beneath the exhaustion. But the fury was not the loudest thing right now. The loudest thing was something simpler, something closer to relief. She knew. It was documented. The people responsible were in custody, and the evidence was complete, and the price they would pay was being calculated in a federal system that did not care about their intentions or their justifications. That would have to be enough. In her experience, it was usually the most that justice managed, and she had learned not to measure justice by the standard of satisfaction because satisfaction was not a legal outcome. Accountability was. And accountability, tonight, had arrived. She walked back to the nursing station. Greta was still at the desk. It was past 9 p.m., and Greta's shift had technically ended at 7, which meant she had stayed, and Simone understood why without it needing to be said. Cross has left the building, Simone said. Greta looked at the door and back. You okay? Getting there. Your cheek looks terrible. I know. Greta slid a piece of paper across the desk. Board meeting is 9 a.m. tomorrow. Holt's assistant called to confirm you were notified. She paused. Also, Priya wants to know if you want her to come with you, for moral support. She said to tell you she'll wear her good scrubs. Simone looked at the piece of paper. Something moved in her chest that was unexpected and small and had nothing to do with Mercer or Cross or federal court orders. It was the specific warmth of people choosing your side without being asked. "Tell her that's not necessary," Simone said. "She's going to come anyway," Greta said. "I know," Simone said. She drove home and slept and woke before the alarm and arrived at Hargrove at 8:40 a.m. in her own clothes. Dark slacks, a gray blouse, flat shoes, because she was not a surgeon and did not have a title, and the meeting was not about performing anything. It was about stating what was true. Priya was in the lobby in her good scrubs, as promised, sitting in one of the chairs near the entrance with a coffee from the cart outside that she handed over without comment when Simone walked in. Simone took it and said nothing, and they went up together in the elevator. And Priya got off on the floor before the boardroom level and went to her shift. And that was the whole of it. No speech, no declaration, just someone showing up. The boardroom was on the administrative floor, a room Simone had never been in. Oval table, 8 chairs, windows on the east side that let in morning light at an angle that made the room seem warmer than it probably was. 4 board members were already seated when she arrived. Holt was there at the far end of the table, not at the head. That seat was empty, with a controlled expression and his hands flat on the table in front of him. The board's legal counsel was a woman named Adeze Obi, who introduced herself briefly and ran the meeting with the efficiency of someone who had been handed a complex situation and had organized it into components. She laid out the sequence: the fraudulent complaint, the compromised administrative credentials, Fitch's arrest, the federal court order, and the withdrawal of Holt's reprimand. She presented it as a sequence of facts with documentary support, which was the right approach because the room didn't need narrative. It needed clarity. Then she said, "We've also received a statement from Mr. Garrison Okafor regarding Ms. Voss's background. With her permission, I'd like to read the relevant portion into the record." Simone said yes. Obi read it. It was not long. Okafor had written in the direct, undecorated style of someone who had spent years writing operational reports, and the lack of ornamentation made it hit harder than any formal tribute would have. He described the incident in general terms: classified location redacted, specific operational details redacted, but the core of it was plain. She had kept 3 people alive under conditions where most trained medical personnel would have lost at least one of them, with equipment that was inadequate, over a duration that exceeded any reasonable expectation. He wrote that he had never, in his time of service, encountered a person who performed better under extreme pressure and with fewer resources. He wrote that Hargrove General had, without knowing it, employed someone whose capabilities exceeded what her current role required, and that her record of service deserved to be known to the institution that held her professional future in its hands. The room was quiet when Obi finished. Simone looked at the middle distance above the table and felt the words settle into her and did not let her face do anything that would embarrass her. Then one of the board members, an older man whose name card read Gerald Sutton, said, "Ms. Voss, I want to ask you directly. Were you aware that your personnel file was being accessed without proper authorization?" "No," she said. "I became aware of it last night. And the events of Tuesday evening, the patient, the federal presence in the building. Did you take any action that you would characterize as outside the scope of your nursing duties?" She considered that for a moment. "I provided information about the building's layout to a federal agent conducting an active investigation. I assisted in physically restraining a dangerous individual who was attempting to reach a patient, and I continued to provide appropriate nursing care to the patient in question throughout the course of the night." Sutton looked at her. "Did you ever identify yourself to hospital staff as anything other than a nurse?" "No," she said. "I am a nurse. I was a nurse that night. The other things I did that night were things I was capable of because of my background, but I was there as a nurse." The distinction seemed to land. She had not prepared it as a soundbite. It was just the accurate thing. Holt spoke for the first time. He had been quiet through the entire presentation, and when he spoke, he did not look at the board members. He looked at her. "I'd like to formally retract the characterization in my original incident report," he said. "I described the intervention in Trauma 1 as a protocol violation. I want to state for the record that characterization was incorrect. The intervention was clinically appropriate, and it saved the patient's life. The protocol that failed that night was mine, not hers." The room was very still. Adeze Obi wrote something down. 3 days later, Raymond Fitch was formally charged with 8 counts of unauthorized disclosure of protected personnel information, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and 2 counts of aiding and abetting a federal investigation obstruction. The charges were public record. His name appeared in the Crestfield news cycle for exactly 1 day before being absorbed into the larger Mercier story, which ran for a week before the news moved on to other things. That was how it worked. The people who had been damaged by what he did would carry it longer than a week, but the news would not, and that asymmetry was its own kind of ordinary injustice that no court order addressed. Mercer himself was charged federally on 14 counts. The 2 deaths in Phoenix and Raleigh were reclassified as active homicide investigations with the dossier as primary evidence. Those investigations were ongoing. The outcomes were not guaranteed, and Simone had made peace with that before she was done reading the first press release, because she had been around long enough to know that the system moved slowly and imperfectly, and sometimes not at all. And the absence of guaranteed outcomes was not the same as the absence of effort. 2 of the 3 foreign buyers were identified. One was in a country without an extradition agreement. The other was not. The legal proceedings on that one would take years. She did not follow all of it closely. She followed enough to know what was happening, and then she returned her attention to the things that were in front of her. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Hargrove General's incoming chief of clinical operations, a position that had been vacant for 3 months following the previous holder's retirement, was posted for internal applications. Adaeze Obi called Simone on a Thursday afternoon to tell her the board would welcome her application. She said she would think about it. That night she sat in her apartment with the window open and the city sounds coming in and thought about what thinking about it actually meant. The clinical operations role was not a nursing role. It was administrative, structural, the kind of position that shaped how a floor ran rather than running it directly. She was good at the direct work. She knew she was good at it. Giving it up for a title was not obviously the right trade. But she also knew what the floor looked like from inside the nursing station at 2 a.m. when a patient's file was in the wrong hands and a surgeon's ego was the first line of clinical decision-making, and the nurses who caught the things that got missed had no structural mechanism to make their catches count. She had lived inside that gap for 4 years. She knew exactly what it cost and what it produced and where it failed. She called Obi back on Friday morning and said yes. She finished the call and sat with the phone in her hand and thought about Okafor, who was recovering at a secure location outside the city and who had texted her exactly twice since his discharge. Once to tell her the hemodiaphragm repair was holding and he was sleeping without pain medication, and once to say thank you, to which she had responded with a single thumbs up, because she had never found a better response to that particular word from that particular category of person, and she suspected she never would. She thought about the comms cable in Kandahar, the vehicle door, 3 men who were alive because she had refused to do the math that said they wouldn't be. She had not thought of herself as remarkable in that corridor. She had thought of herself as someone with a problem and insufficient resources and a specific window of time. And she had worked the problem with what she had, and it had been enough. That was the whole of it. That was always the whole of it. She had spent 6 years treating that chapter like something to be managed rather than something to be integrated, and it had followed her anyway. Not as punishment, not as consequence, but as simple fact. What she had done was real. What she was capable of was real. And spending energy on keeping those things invisible did not make them not true. It just made her smaller than she was. She was not interested in being smaller than she was. She was 41 years old and she had a bruise fading on her left cheekbone and a new job title she hadn't asked for and a patient in recovery somewhere outside Crestfield who was sleeping without pain medication. And the morning was coming through the window at the same angle it always did, ordinary and indifferent and available, and she had work to do. On her first official day in the new role, she arrived at 7:30, which was earlier than she needed to because she was always early and no one had ever noticed, and she had stopped waiting for them to. She walked through the ER floor on the way to the administrative wing, not because it was the fastest route, but because it was her floor, the one she knew. And she wanted to see it with the morning shift coming in and the night shift handing off and all the ordinary movement of people doing difficult work without drama or recognition. Greta was at the nursing station. She looked up when Simone passed and raised her coffee cup in a gesture that was not quite a salute and not quite a toast and was entirely Greta. Simone raised her own cup back and kept walking. Holt was coming out of the elevator as she passed it. He saw her and stopped, and for a moment they stood in the corridor with everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks between them, like a country they had both crossed from different directions and arrived at the same border of. "Voss," he said. "Holt," she said. He looked like he had something prepared. Then he looked like he had reconsidered it. "Good luck," he said. Not warmly. She did not need it warmly, just plainly. The way you say something to a person you have learned to respect without yet knowing how to show it, which was a beginning, and beginnings were not nothing. "You too," she said, and kept walking. Here is what nobody tells you about being underestimated for a long time. It changes the texture of your confidence. It doesn't always destroy it. Some people are built in ways that make them impervious, and those people exist, and they are not the rule. For most people, years of being dismissed accumulates like sediment. You start to second-guess the moments when you know. You develop the reflex of pulling back the correct answer until someone with a better title confirms it. You learn to absorb because absorbing feels safer than the alternative. And sometimes it is safer. And sometimes it is just the path of least resistance wearing the costume of wisdom. Simone had done all of that. She was not ashamed of it. It had kept her functional in environments that would have ground a less adaptive person to dust. But it had also cost her things. Not dramatic things, not the kind of costs that make a good story, but the quiet kind. The accumulated weight of years of making herself smaller than she was so that the room could feel comfortable. She was done with that. Not loudly. Not as a declaration. She was not a person who made declarations. She was a person who showed up early and worked the problem with the tools available and kept going when the tools were inadequate because the work was real and the patients were real and the moment in front of her was always the one that mattered. She had been those things before anyone knew her name. She was still those things now. The administrative wing was quiet at 7:30. Her new office was a room she had never been in, with a desk she had never sat at, and a window that faced the interior courtyard rather than the street, and a stack of folders from Obi with a note on top that said, "Start wherever makes sense. There are no wrong answers on day one." She sat down, opened the first folder, started reading. Outside, Hargrove General woke up the way hospitals woke up. Not all at once, but in pieces, each department finding its rhythm, the building filling with the particular noise of people beginning the work of keeping other people alive. She could hear it through the walls, faint and constant, the way you hear the ocean from a room that faces the water. She had spent 6 years keeping her head down in that noise. Now she was going to change what it sounded like. She turned the page and kept reading, and the morning came through the courtyard window at the angle mornings always come, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.